Before live service games and battle passes became the norm in the gaming industry, Ubisoft was actually considered one of the best companies out there. Like, the Assassin's Creed series was a genre-defining title back in the day that had a bunch of other studios out there trying to replicate that same gameplay formula. But in recent years, though, it feels like Ubisoft just hasn't been able to keep up with the new direction that the industry's been going in, and everything that they've been releasing lately just has been flopping so hard that their stock price has actually been hitting record lows. And now there's a bunch of news outlets out there also talking about how there's a possible file for bankruptcy later this year. So unless their upcoming game, Assassin's Creed Shadows, somehow manages to blow people's expectations away, it's really not looking good for Ubisoft. But that game already has a bunch of controversy under it ever since the trailer dropped, and now because of that, everybody's kind of just expecting Assassin's Creed Shadows to just flop as well. But if you feel any sort of sympathy for this multi-million-dollar company, or maybe you think that, hey, they deserve a break after having such a tough year in 2024, well, allow me to kindly remind you that these were the exact same people telling you all the way back in January that you, the player, needed to get comfortable with the idea of not owning any of your games. They were delisting and shutting down servers for a lot of their online-only games with no way of actually being able to play them, even if you owned a physical copy of it. And Ubisoft has also been pushing the hardest for this aggressive monetization practice on games that release in barely working condition, and has gotten to the point where their once golden reputation with the community has fallen off so hard that the entire internet right now is kind of just praying for their downfall. I mean, obviously it sucks when you see a studio that closes down and thousands of developers are losing their jobs in the process. I'm not saying that's something we should celebrate, but the executive team at Ubisoft that's in charge of making all the important decision making, it's like they just forgot overnight that when it comes to selling a product to a customer, the number one rule you gotta follow here is that, you gotta sell something that people are actually interested in buying. And even though this isn't really a problem that just magically started happening last year, well, now's when you can actually see the consequences of all their years of neglect, because how many major titles did they release last year versus how many of them actually succeeded? Well, you had a brand new Prince of Persia game that came out in January with Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown that didn't technically flop or fail dramatically like their other games, but it was a pretty big disappointment when it was first announced. Because when people hear the name Prince of Persia, they're probably thinking about some big budget 3D action game, kind of like how you would expect from their IP nowadays. But what we actually ended up getting was a 2.5D cartoony side-scroller game that was more of a Metroidvania than anything else, kind of like Hollow Knight, for example. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with Hollow Knight. I think the game is a masterpiece, and the Metroidvania genre is a very popular genre as well, But it's like, imagine Rockstar decided to announce a brand new GTA game, and, they get everybody hyped for it, and, everybody's excited about it, they're talking about it, but when the trailer finally comes out, it just ends up being a turn-based RPG. It doesn't really meet expectations. It doesn't really make sense. So with this brand new Prince of Persia game, not only did they try to charge you $50 for it on release, which I think is ridiculous, Metroidvanias usually go around like $20 to $30. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown just ended up not doing too well with fans of the franchise. But that was just one game that didn't meet their expectations, right? There's nothing wrong with that, because that was more of a AA game than a AAA, so it wasn't necessarily breaking the bank for Ubisoft here. But the game that they released afterwards, the world's first quadruple A game, according to the CEO at Ubisoft, that one really did end up hurting them. Because Skull and Bones went from being the world's first quadruple A game to one of the biggest flops in gaming history. Like, according to some journalist websites that had insiders that were coming out with reports saying that Skull and Bones cost Ubisoft over $800 million to make, and it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because the game was stuck in development hell for like 10 years. 10 whole years of development time, and all you got was disappointment in the end. But this was supposed to be, the next big pirate adventure game that was going to replace Sea of Thieves and bring Ubisoft back into the spotlight. But man, when they came out with the game, it was just terrible. It was really terrible, because Skull and Bones had loading screens every time you went to and from your ship. There wasn't like any melee fights or ground combat in the game, so all the action that happened inside of the game had to be done from your ships. So you do ship battles with your opponents and all of that stuff, but like the worst part is that you couldn't even board and raid enemy ships either. So the gameplay of Skull and Bones itself just really felt extremely out of touch from what people would normally want to do in a pirate game. There's like a list of things you would expect from a pirate game of things that you want to do, and Skull and Bones didn't have any of them. It was more of a sailing simulator that had everybody wishing they could just play Assassin's Creed Black Flag, a game from 11 years ago, instead of playing modern-day Skull and Bones. Like, all they had to do if they wanted to make a successful game here was make multiplayer Black Flag. That's it. If they did that, they'd be printing millions of dollars, but they didn't. So the $70 price tag, the live service practices, the battle passes, all of that being baked into Skull and Bones, like, you can tell why nobody really bought it. There was even a report saying that during its peak, when the game was already out, there was only a max of 850,000 unique players, which, is a decent-sized sized number, but realistically nowhere near what they needed to make up for all the money that they spent. And that number, unfortunately, was also including everybody who got the 8-hour free trial, so the actual initial sales of the game were probably a lot worse than that. Now that's 2 Ubisoft fails in a row. If I was an investor in the company, I'd be starting to sweat a little bit by now, because that's a lot of money that's going down the drain. Oh, and going back to the topic of live service here, Ubisoft also came out with Defiant last year, which was only around for 7 months before they announced that the game would be shutting down. And this one I feel like I've talked about a lot. You know, I've talked about Defiant a lot recently in my videos, so I'll keep this one short. But Ubisoft released Defiant while trying to come up with a Call of Duty competitor that was in the online multiplayer FPS genre. You know, it had everything you needed for that type of game. You had a fast-paced shooter game with weapon customizations, different classes and abilities, and their main selling point was the fact that you're going to be playing old-school Call of Duty, because this game's unranked mode didn't have skill-based matchmaking, unlike every other competitive shooter game that's out there in the market. But in Defiant is where you could really see Ubisoft at their best, giving you their signature Ubislop, because Defiant was a buggy, broken mess when it came out. Like, there was a lot of things that were just outright not working with the game, like the hit reg issues, people getting locked out of using their abilities mid-match, and a bunch of like server issues as well. So this game was really in a broken state when it came out. A lot of the people that were playing Defiant early on release could really tell that the game just felt rushed to hit the market to start monetizing, because the item shop was working perfectly. You know, there was nothing wrong with the item shop or the battle passes or the microtransactions, but so much of the game just wasn't ready for launch. And you know, when you're trying to come up with a direct competitor to one of the biggest franchises in gaming, you know, you really can't afford to half-ass it here and release something in the state that Defiant was when it did come out. And not many people actually know this, but if you remember back in the day, Ubisoft announced that they were working on a brand new The Division game called Heartland, which was originally going to be a battle royale that then got turned into a PvPvE that people were rumoring that it was going to turn into some sort of extraction shooter. You know, they still didn't know exactly what they were doing with that game. Well, the point is that people were excited for that game to come out. You know, people were looking forward to that, but The Division Heartland ended up getting cancelled because they needed more dev power over at Defiant and Rainbow Six Siege. So the fact that Defiant ended up flopping hard after just a few months, you know, it just really leaves you wondering if, like, what if they had worked on The Division Heartland instead? Maybe things could have been different here. And the last major release that Ubisoft had in 2024, unfortunately, was a pretty big disaster too. Like with Star Wars Outlaws, they were selling the idea of having this sort of like Han Solo type adventure with combat and stealth mechanics, and Ubisoft being, you know, the masters at making stealth games because of the Assassin's Creed series, of course, well, this game was supposed to be a cakewalk for them. But surprisingly, that was also one of the main criticisms that the game had, you know, because they were selling the idea of having a stealth mechanic in the game that was going to be very important, and then you ended up really not needing it at all because of how dumb the NPCs in the game were. Like, the AI for the enemies was just ridiculously, hilariously bad, and Star Wars Outlaws also felt like it was borrowing mechanics from all the other Ubisoft titles as well, but just doing them worse, you know, so you can tell that, again, you know, the game felt like it needed a lot more polishing, and it was just plagued with technical issues. The combat and the stealth parts of the game were boring and repetitive, and the amount of content in Star Wars Outlaws, you know, I gotta say, was impressive because there were so many worlds and side missions and quest chains to follow, but at the end of the day, that was all padding and bloat to make the game appear larger. You know, there's no point in having that much content in the game if people are just genuinely not interested in playing it. There was even a post by the people at Ubisoft saying that after 4 months since the game had come out, not a single player had unlocked their own faith here that you got from, you know, doing this short quest line in the game. So that's how uninterested people were in actually diving into the extra content in Star Wars Outlaws. That's how boring the experience really was. So Star Wars Outlaws, this was just Ubisoft once again doing the thing that they built such a horrible reputation on, which is releasing unfinished games and frustrating the player base just to be able to meet a deadline and release it, and then just doing the surprise Pikachu phase when people just don't want to buy their games anymore. So Star Wars Outlaws flopping wasn't just another failed attempt at winning over the players and, you know, it's okay champ, keep going, we'll get him next time. No, this was the end of a disastrous year for Ubisoft, with the back-to-back stinkers and millions of dollars down the drain. Star Wars Outlaws underperforming is actually the main reason why Ubisoft decided to delay Assassin's Creed Shadows all the way to February of 2025, because realistically, there was just no way they were going to be able to release a fully functional game if we went off just based off the promotional gameplay footage that they were showing us, and a lot of people are already expecting it to underperform. You know, I gotta say that ever since the Assassin's Creed trailer dropped, it's just been plagued with controversies back to back, you know, going from like the main character pick to people arguing how the game is portrayed, the accuracy of the world. You know, there's a lot of nonsense out there, but there's also a lot of legit criticism as well. But overall, with Assassin's Creed Shadows, people are just expecting Ubisoft to just keep doing what they do and just release a half-assed game, and if we've learned anything from the gaming industry in 2024, is that it was the year that the slop flopped. And if Shadows does end up being a slop, then I'm pretty sure it's gonna flop. Like, people just don't really have the tolerance anymore for overhyped and underwhelming content. So if Ubisoft is somehow able to walk out of this in one piece and shift their focus back to actually making good games that the people want to play, I'd be like the happiest person in the world. You know, I don't actively prey on the downfall of people and companies and jobs. You know, I just want them to be able to release cool stuff that I'm actually interested in playing, you know? And it looks like Assassin's Creed Shadows actually might be their last Hail Mary attempt at making something happen, you know, just see if the magic is there. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.